Hello and welcome back to Economics per se. Today I'm going to start a new chapter called Demand and Supply. This is one of the most important chapters in microeconomics and of course in economics itself, as demand and supply are the two things that are surrounded by the entire world of economics. In this chapter we will learn about competitive market, demand curve, supply curve, and market equilibrium. In this video, however, I will only be discussing about competitive market and demand curve. So far, we have established that markets are consisted of buyers and sellers. And for this chapter of ours, we will only be focusing on a particular type of market, and that market is called competitive market. In this type of market, there are many buyers and sellers of the same good or the same service. The key feature of a competitive market is that no individual's choices or actions will have a noticeable effect on the price at which the good or the service is sold. It is also important to understand that this is not an accurate description of every market. We will learn more about the other types of markets in the later videos. For now, let's focus on our competitive market. We can explain the competitive markets by the supply and demand model. And as most of the markets are competitive, using supply and demand model is more promising while explaining those markets. Basically, the supply and demand model illustrates how a competitive market behaves. Now, there are 5 key elements in this model, the supply and demand model, and those are, first of which is the demand curve. The second one is the supply curve. The third one is the factors that shift the demand and the supply curve, demand and supply curves. Fourth one is market equilibrium. Market equilibrium is actually it includes the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And the fifth one is the way the market equilibrium changes with the shifts in the supply and the demand curve. As I mentioned earlier in this video, in this video I will only be discussing the demand curve. So now let's dive into that. Consider a market of apples, and now ask this question to yourself: how many kilograms of apple do consumers want to buy in a given year? You might suggest that we can look up online how many kilos of apples are bought every day in Canada and multiply that number by 365 and then make an approximation to conclude our answer. But that is not enough to answer the question. This is because when the price of apple goes up, some people will respond to the change in price by buying less apples or maybe switch to eating peach as a substitute. In other words, the quantity of apple an individual or a group of individuals would want to consume depends on the price of apple itself. The higher the price, the less apple people would want to purchase. And alternatively, the lower the price, the more apple people would want to purchase. So the answer to the question, how many kilos of apples do consumers want to buy in a given year, is that it depends on the price of 1 kilo of apple. And to find the price of a kilogram of apples, we can start by making a table of how many kilos of apple people would want to buy at a number of different prices. Such a table is known as the demand schedule, and demand schedule can in turn be used to draw a demand curve. As I have just mentioned, demand schedule is simply a table that shows how much of a good or a service consumers will want to buy at different prices. Let's say for us, there is a hypothetical demand schedule for apples, and that schedule would look something like this. When the price is $4, the quantity demanded for apples would be, let's say, 1 kilogram. When it's $3.5, let's say it's now 2 kilograms. And this will go on like this. 5, when it's 2, let's say 5 here, when it's 1.5, 6 and dollar at a dollar per kilogram, people would consume 7 kilograms of apple. So from the table we can see that if the price is rising, then the quantity demanded of apple falls. When the price goes from $1 to $4, the quantity demanded for apple decreases from 7 kilograms to 1 kilogram. And the quantity demanded is the actual amount of a good or a service consumers are willing and are able to buy at a specific price. If we put the points from the table on a graph, where in the x-axis, we have the quantity of apples, and on the y-axis we have the price of apples per kilogram, that is. If we plot these points on this graph, we will get something like this. When the price is $4, the quantity demanded for apple is 1 kilogram. When it is 3.5, so this is 1 point, 3.5, this 2, when it's 3, quantity demanded is 3 kilograms, so then here for 2.5 it's 4, here 2, it's 5, which is here, 1.5, it's 6, which is here, and 1, which for $1 per kilogram, people are demanding 7 kilograms of apple. And if we join these dots, we get the demand curve. Let's call it D. This is the demand curve. The demand curve is a graphical representation of the demand schedule, and it shows the relationship between the quantity demanded and the price of a good. And the fact that with a rise in the price, the quantity demanded falls while holding other things equal is known as the law of demand. In a more formal way, the law of demand says that a higher price of a good or service with other things held constant or equal, it will lead people to demand a smaller quantity of that good or that service. So this is the graph we derived from the demand schedule, or the table we had earlier. Now, there are two types of changes that can come to a demand curve. One of those is movement along the demand curve. a movement along the demand curve is a change in the quantity demanded of a good arising from change in that good's price itself. This is what happens if we move from one point to the another. This would be a movement along the curve if if the price of apples per kilogram decreases from $3.5 to $3. The movement along the curve will be from here to here, where the quantity demanded would increase from 2 to 3, as the law of demand suggests. Another type of change that can come to a demand curve is a shift of the demand curve. The shift of the demand curve is a change in the quantity demanded at any given price, represented by the shift of the original demand curve to a new position, denoted by a new demand curve. So if a shift of this demand curve D, let's call it D1, were to happen, it can happen in either ways. The demand curve D1 can shift to right, or we can call it a rightward shift, and this will be a new demand curve at a new position. Look what's happening here. Here, at the same price, $2.5 per kilogram, the individuals are demanding more than it used to do in D1. The quantity demanded now changed from 4 to 5. The same thing can happen in the opposite direction as well. The demand curve can move to the left, or it can be said that the demand curve shifted leftward. Let's call this new demand curve D3. And here again, as you can see, at a given price, let's say 2.5 again, at $2.5, when the individuals used to buy 4 kilograms of apples, now it's demanding here 3 kilograms of apples at $2.5. This is coming from 4 to 3. So there are two things happening here. With the movement along the curve, the quantity demanded is changing, and with the shift of the curve, the demand itself is changing. Then you might have a question now: what shifts the demand curve? You might have noticed that when I defined the law of demand, I said the law of demand dictates that that a rise in its price, with a rise in its price, the quantity demanded of a good falls while holding the other things equal or constant. The changes in those other things basically causes the demand curves to shift either leftward or rightward. Economists believe that there are 6 principal factors that go into those other things, goes into changing those other things and shift the demand curve. And those 6 principal factors are 6 principal factors that shift the demand curve are: number 1 is a change in the price of the substitutes. Two goods are called substitutes if a rise in the price of one good leads to an increase in the demand for the other good. For example, peach can be a substitute of apple. If the price for peach increases, then the demand for peach would fall, and in turn people might want to substitute from peach to apple, thus leading the quantity demanded for apple to increase. The second principal factor that shifts the demand curve is the change in the price of the complements. Two goods are said to be complements if a rise in the price of one good leads to a decrease in the demand for the other. For example, chocolate can be a complement for apple, to make candy apples. So if the price of chocolate increases, there's a high chance that the quantity demanded for apples would fall for the people who like candy apples. And now the third principal factor that shifts the demand curve is change in income. When individuals have more income, they tend to buy more of one good at any given price. Think about it. If your income increases and you like apples, would you not eat more apples? Now, here's the catch. I said if you like apples. It means that apple is a normal good for you. When a rise in income increases the demand for a good, it is a normal good. Most products in most of the markets are normal goods. Another type of goods is inferior good. When a rise in income decreases the demand for a good, then that good is an inferior good. Say your income increased and now you prefer to have gourmet burgers from high-end restaurants instead of McDonald's burgers. So in this case, McDonald's burgers is an inferior good to you because your income increased and you started demanding less of it. The fourth principal factor is change in tastes or preferences. Change in preferences or tastes. Changes in preferences also affect the demand for a good. For example, let's say for some reasons you now don't like crunchiness in your fruits, and thus you switch to drinking apple juice, or maybe started eating orange. In this situation, this situation will end up shifting the demand curve for apple to leftward, decreasing the demand for apple. Now, the fifth principal factor that shifts the demand curve is change in expectations. If people expect that the price of a certain good will increase in the future, they will start stockpiling now, and the demand for that good will increase. The opposite will happen if they expect the price of a certain good to decrease in the future. The demand for that good would decrease. Now, the sixth and the final principal factor that shifts the demand curve, either rightward or leftward, is change in the number of consumers. If the number of consumers decreases, the demand for a certain good would decrease as well. And if the number of consumers for a given good increases, the demand for that good will increase as well. Now we will look into how the 6 principal factors that shape the demand curve actually shape the demand curve with this graph. The first principal factor that shapes the demand curve is the change in the prices of the substitutes. Let's say for apple, the substitute product is peach. If the price of peach increases, then the demand for peach would decrease, and it will lead to an increase in the demand for apple. So the increase in demand for apple can be shown with a rightward shift of the demand curve for apple, and we are denoting the new demand curve by D2. If the opposite had happened, let's say the price of peach fell. If the price of peach fell, then the demand for peach would increase, and in turn people will be demanding apples less. And we can show this change in the price of the substitute of apple by shifting the demand curve for apple leftward. Let's call it D3. Now, what does this change imply? This change shows that at a given price, let's say this is price P1, at a given price, when the price of the substitute is falling, people are demanding less of apple at Q3, where initially they demanded somewhere here at Q1. And when the price of the substitute increased, we've shown that change of the price of the substitute increased by shifting the demand curve rightward. And what happened there in the first scenario is at a given price, P1, the quantity demanded for apples changed from Q1, from here, the initial level, when the price of the substitute increased, to here, increasing the quantity demanded for apples to Q2. We can also explain the change in prices of complements, the second factor that shaped the demand curve, in the same way we did the first one. If the price of the complement, let's say for our apples, the complement product was chocolates. So the price for chocolates increased. Let's say decreased. The price of chocolates decreased. Then the demand for chocolates would increase, and for the people who love candy apples, the demand for apples would increase as well, and thus the rightward shift. This same condition will take place again. And now let's say the price of chocolates or the price of complements for apple increased. Then the demand for chocolate will decrease. Again, as the law of demand suggests, the demand for chocolate, the decrease in the demand for chocolate will in turn decrease the demand for apples. And again, this leftward shift will take place as it did before. In the same way, the change in income, let's say the income increased. if the income increases, if Apple is a normal good to you, the demand for Apple will increase as well, and thus a rightward shift. And if normal good, and let's say the income is decreasing for you, then it would in turn decrease the demand for apples for you, if again normal good. This same condition will apply with the ships. Now, if Apple was inferior good to you, then the second sets of conditions will apply. If income increases, then you will switch to a better product, let's say apple juice or something else. If income increases, then demand for apple would decrease if inferior good, and the leftward shift will take place. And if the income decreases, the demand for apple would increase if inferior good. And a rightward shift will take place for the demand curve. In the again, in the same way, the preference can be preference or the taste of the individuals can be explained, that how the preference can shift the demand curve leftward or rightward. If a person prefers apples more, the demand for apple would increase, thus the rightward shift of the demand curve from D1 to D2. And if the person prefers less apple now, prefers apple less, then demand for apple would decrease, and a leftward shift of the demand curve will take place, where the demand function will be changing from D1 to D3. Now, with the changes in the expectations, the price expectations, the same thing will happen. If the expected price, with E I'm denoting the expected price or the future price. The future price of apple increases. If the future price of apple increases, the demand for apple will increase now, because people would want to buy more now than spend more money later. And rightward shift in the demand curve will take place. If the expected price of apple or the future price of apple falls, if people expect that the price of apple will be falling in the future, then the demand for apple now would go down. Leftward shift will happen, and this will happen because people will be expecting the price of apple to go down, and they would not want to spend more money on apples now. Finally, the last factor that makes a shift in the demand curves is changes in the number of consumers. Now, to understand this, we must also understand individual demand curves. In individual demand curves, the individual demand curves illustrate the relationship between quantity demanded and price of a certain good for one individual consumer. Let's say in our market for apples, there are two consumers of apples. One is Tom and the other one is Jill, and collectively they consume five kilograms of apples at a given price of $2 per kilogram. And they divide this collective number among themselves, where Tom consumes 3 kilograms of apples and Jill consumes 2 kilograms of apples. Now, let's say that Tom decreased his consumption because, let's say, his income fell. So his demand curve would shift leftward, where he is consuming, let's say, 2 kilograms of apple now. And this would reflect here, where the market at the same price of $2 per kilogram, the market for apple would have a demand of, let's say, 2 plus 2, 4 kilograms of apples. The opposite would happen if, let's say, Jill has suddenly grown a taste for apple, and her demand for apple increased at this given price of $2 per kilogram to, let's say, 3 kilograms of apples. And this change would reflect in the market for apple by shifting the market demand curve rightward with a change like this, where at a given price of $2 per kilogram in the market, people, or our people here, the two individuals, Tom and Jill, are collectively consuming or demanding 3 plus 3, 6 kilograms of apples. And this is how the 6 principal factors make the shift in the demand curves happen. Well, that's all for today. In the next video, we will learn about supply curve. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and comment and subscribe to our channel. I will see you next.